Hi, this is Andy. Okay, here's what I want you to do as a listener to the podcast today. I want you to fill in the blanks, right? A winner never, I bet you know what the answer is, right? A winner never quits and a quitter never wins, right? You know this. It's been drilled into your head from an early age. I coached my son's grade 5-6 basketball team in the gym we played in earlier this week. Guess what? There's a sign on the wall with that exact quote, right? It's a generally accepted truth that winners never quit and quitters never win. The only problem with that, of course, is that it's not true at all, or at least it oversimplifies the reality of the world that we live and we lead in. So much of what we do as leaders of projects and teams is to make decisions. And could it be that our inability to quit a project or a vendor or a tool or a team member, could it be that even our career is being hindered because we're persisting instead of quitting? Well, today I'm joined by one of my favorite voices on decision-making. Annie Duke is the author of a new book entitled Quit: The Power of Knowing When to Walk Away. Now, you may know of Annie because of her previous books on decision-making, such as Thinking in Bets. Well, today we're going to discuss something that wasn't really elaborated on in her earlier books. We're going to talk about quitting. And assuming you keep listening, you don't quit, you're going to walk away with some practical ideas that you can start using this week. A quick note, a healthy view of quitting, it's an example of a skill that we just don't learn as students. And if you've listened to us for a while, you know our passion is not just for adults in the workforce, it's also for students to learn important skills to prepare them for their careers. If you know of a high school or college age student and want to invest in them, check out our new e-learning program entitled Getting Stuff Done: Project Management for Students. They can learn how to reduce their stress and thrive with their schooling now, and you'll be giving them a head start to more confidently lead and deliver when they launch their career. Learn more and get a copy for them at peopleandprojectspodcast.com/getting stuff done. Thanks. Let's jump into today's discussion with Annie about her new book, Quit. So Annie, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
Before we get into the book, I'd love for our listeners to learn more about you. I mean, if we went back to, how about this, before your poker days, back before you're on track to be an academic, perhaps even back before your first job at Kentucky Fried Chicken, can you think of anything from your family culture or experiences growing up that might have formed you in some ways to now be one of the most influential voices on decision-making?
Oh my gosh, I feel like we always make these things up. Like we make the past fit the present.
Time travel.
So I wouldn't necessarily say that my mother and father were like the best decision makers
Right.
in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, I will tell you this was that it was pounded into us as children that like sticking to things, toughing things out was a sign of character. So two things from my father. The first was he used to brag that he never missed a day of work, like no matter how sick he was. Now, obviously, this was pre-pandemic,
right.
So we weren't as horrified at, wait, what, you went to work with 103 fever? Now we'd be like, yo, stay away from me. No, but he used to really pride himself on that, like never missed a day of work. And that was a big talking point in our household, to the point where, like, if we took a sick day from school, it was a little like, are you my child? Like, what is wrong with you? Why aren't you toughing this out?
Yeah.
So definitely got that message. And then also my father, who's an excellent tennis player, used to compete in like regional tournament, like the club championship, but then also like New England regional amateur championship, so on and so forth. He was really good. But he also had a lot of problems with sort of electrolyte imbalance, which even in New England, which is cooler, in August was a really big problem. So he would be out playing and he would be sweating so much, the sweat would be coming through the soles of his shoes. And you would see these big size 14, he was very tall, wet footprints out on the red clay of the courts that he played on. And he would be playing like in the semifinal, he would win the match and he would start cramping like really badly. We'd have to take him to the hospital to get his electrolytes, and then he'd be back out on the court the next day. So you just kind of got this sense of like, this is character, stick to things, don't be weak. Those kinds of things. And I don't want to make it sound like my father wasn't a totally loving father. It was his own stuff that was obviously coming through to us. So I think that was quite formative for me
Yeah, I
in the
bet.
way that I sort of think about the world and what does
Mhm.
it mean to be productive and
Yeah.
those kinds of things. So I don't know if that answers your
No,
question,
it
but
does.
that's
It
what
does.
came to
It's interesting.
mind.
He would have been like one of the marathon runners you talked about, where they're finishing it with the fibula that's broken or whatever.
A
That
hundred
that would
percent.
have totally
Like,
been him. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And he would have bragged about it, like
Right.
for the rest.
Exactly.
And then if you quit when you broke your leg, he'd be like, "What's wrong with you?
Yeah.
Like, what are you,
Yeah.
weak?"
Yeah. I've got some of that in my background as well. And I think to different degrees, I think a lot of us grew up with this mindset. So if I had to summarize the big idea of the book, Annie, and I talked about it in the intro, it's we're told from a young age that winners never quit, quitters never win. And contrary to popular belief, winners quit a lot. Right? In
They
fact,
really do.
that's how they win. So one of the early ideas in the book that caught my eye is this: successful people quit a lot, but we don't notice it. We don't celebrate those quits. So how about this? Let's celebrate a time that you personally quit. Okay. That maybe a lot of people don't know about. Can you think of a time that you quit in a good way, and maybe it's something we can learn from that?
Sure. I mean, I have lots of them. Here's one. I actually, going back to my child, we'll just have a therapy session.
Yeah, let's do that.
Going
That's
back
what
to
I
my
want.
childhood, I tried really hard to quit something,
Mm,
and my mom wouldn't let me.
yeah.
And I'm really proud that I figured out at that age that I was supposed to be quitting.
Mm,
So she really wanted me to play piano. She played piano, and so she had me take piano lessons. And I'm tone deaf,
mm,
like for real. Like
mm.
if I started singing, it would be painful for you.
We could try.
So let's just say like music maybe wasn't the best thing for me to be doing because I was super toned deaf. So she started having me take these lessons when I was 8, and I went to her pretty quickly because also like the teacher knew that I was bad. And
Mm,
I said, like, this isn't for me, mom. Like, this is kind of a waste of my after school time.
yeah.
I shouldn't be doing this. And she said, no, you have to stick to it. And she made me do it for a year.
Mm.
Um, and I still look back on that, like I made such a good case. And the thing was like, I wasn't saying like I want to quit and go do nothing.
Right. Right.
Right. Like
Yeah.
I was like, I want to be doing something else with my time. So anyway, after she finally released me after a year, I think maybe the piano teacher said something to her, like, this is really
Right.
painful for me.
Exactly. Right, yeah.
I started doing gymnastics, which I stuck to for 6 years.
Mm,
So, I mean, it's not like I'm not a gritty person, but I would say that was definitely a time when I didn't quit, but I wanted to, but I didn't have control over the quitting
yeah.
decision.
Yeah.
I would say that the best quit that I ever did was actually quitting poker.
Oh,
I was very successful at it, but it just like it wasn't making me happy anymore. And
mm,
even then, by the way, I still feel like I quit too late, which I think is
mm,
most people when they quit things and they look back, you sort of think I quit too late. But there's all sorts of reasons why I think that was a very hard thing for me to quit. A lot of it had to do with my identity.
right,
I was
right,
on television. It was what people knew me as.
mhm,
And you definitely have this feeling like if I leave, like what does that mean? Who am I?
yeah. Yeah. For sure.
So I'm pretty proud that I walked away from that and haven't been back since in 10 years.
I actually had a question on that. I was going to ask you that. Should you have left earlier? Was it
Yes.
because identity? So I think it's kind of interesting. But
Yes.
but those I feel like are the stories that don't show up in books on this stuff.
No.
Like we celebrate people who soldier on.
Mhm.
Quitters are cowards in the movies and all that stuff. And this thing about celebrating quitting. I think there's something to that we could probably learn from unnoticed quitting. Yeah.
Yeah. So look, here's the thing. Uh, when we say things like winners never quit and quitters never win, I think that what we're really saying is people who have succeeded stuck to it.
Yeah.
In other words, we're thinking retrospectively, right? Like obviously, to succeed at any, like, look at you have a book in your hands that says quit on it because I stuck to it.
Right.
And I finished it.
Yeah.
But what you don't see is that there were lots of things that I started. In fact, I had an idea for a different book before I wrote this one, in between my last two, that I actually started working on. I kind of wrote a little bit of a proposal for it. So, and then I decided that I should abandon it and I shouldn't actually pursue it. But that's not what you're holding in your hand. So what we have to realize is that to be successful at something, you will have had to have stuck to it.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that stick to things and you will succeed. It doesn't work prospectively. It only works retrospectively. And I think this is a really big problem that we have with the way that we think about quitting is that we really get those two things confused.
Mhm.
What the actual answer is, if you stick to things that are worthwhile, you will have some higher probability of success than if you don't really try at it.
Mhm.
Right. And that's still not a guarantee, but it's the thing that we struggle with is the worthwhile part.
Mhm.
Right.
Right.
So I think why we're, part of the reason why we're so enamored with grit is because we understand that things are sometimes really hard and there are obstacles that are going to be in your way. And that doesn't mean that the thing that you're doing is not worthwhile. And we need to develop that character trait of being able to stick to it even so, because it's worthwhile. But, as I say, the opposite of a great virtue is also a great virtue, which is that when the thing isn't worthwhile, and this is what's so important, when it's not worthwhile, then sticking it out is not a sign of good character. It's a sign of poor judgment. Then you ought to quit it, because if you really want to have success, it lies in sticking to the good things and quitting everything else. And in fact, quitting those things as quickly as you possibly can, because every minute, every dollar, every human resource that you stick in something that isn't worthwhile, those are resources that you can't put to something that is worthwhile. And ultimately, that's going to slow your progress down. And I think we have a really hard time seeing it that way.
So true. You talk about in the book that one guy who's like, life is short, right? Life is short. And
Yeah.
we just don't think about that. But in preparation for today, I reached out to some friends and listeners and I said, all right, what were examples of, like, if you could time travel? Like, I like that metaphor that you use. If you could go back and quit instead of persisting, what would it be? And this is, I don't think it's going to surprise you. The most common example was, I regret staying in a bad job situation, right?
Yeah.
And as a way of understanding expected value, I'd love if you'd be up for sharing how you helped an emergency room doctor think through her job situation, because I think that could help people listening to us.
Yeah, there's actually quite a few lessons from her story. Her name is Sarah Ulster Martinez. So here's the problem that we have. We there's sort of like two very big problems that make it hard for us to quit. One is this feeling of waste.
Mm-hmm.
So when with your listeners who are saying, "Oh, I quit that job too late," I bet that if I had caught them in the middle of the decision, I would have heard something like, "I've put so much time into it and I've trained for it and it was onboarded and I spent all this time learning the culture and I know my way around the place," and so on and so forth. So these are all things that you sort of sunk into to whatever it is that you're doing, project, job, whatever, that you feel like if you walk away, that will have been wasted.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a very common thing that stops us from quitting. Of course, what they're pointing out when they say, "Oh, I should have really done it earlier," is let's say that they look back and they say, "I should have done that 6 months earlier." Well, that feeling of worry about having wasted what you've already put in caused them to waste 6 more months. Right. I mean,
Right.
so we have to understand, like, the fear of waste actually causes us to waste time and attention. So that's kind of piece number one, is this sunk cost problem. And then piece number two is something called loss aversion, which comes from Daniel Kahneman. And basically it's that when we're thinking about things that we might start, we really worry about sort of what if they don't work out. Okay. So we're very, very concerned about sort of the downside of any decision, separate and apart from expected value. And expected value is just weighing benefits against costs, right? Like, in other words, if we have some sort of goal that we're trying to achieve, how much ground might this option cause me to gain? If I pursue this particular thing, how much ground might it cause me to gain toward whatever my goals are: happiness, fulfillment, money, whatever, compared to other things that I might be doing. So this is the kind of setting up this whole thing.
Yeah, right,
So,
right,
all right, let's go to Sarah Ulster Martinez. She'll help us understand this. So she got in touch with me in the summer of 2021. Because she had heard me on a podcast where I was road testing the ideas as I was writing them. I was sort of about halfway through the book, I would say.
Nice.
And And she said, oh, I heard you on this podcast and I'm really struggling with whether to quit my job. And I'd love it if you had any advice. So I immediately was like, hey, do you want to get on a Zoom? Because
Yeah.
I was writing a book about quitting.
Yeah.
So I talked to her, and she had been an ER doc and then had been promoted to be a hospital administrator. And for a variety of reasons, it had been a couple years, like a few years, where she had been really miserable in her job. One of the main reasons was that, an ER doc, it's like shift work. So, you put in your time. Once you're out of the hospital, you leave your work behind and you just go and do your life.
Sure.
Whereas when you're an administrator, it's kind of 24/7 emails, tasks, like calls, stuff that you have to attend to. And she didn't enjoy that aspect of it. She didn't like having to bring her work home. And particularly, she felt like it was interfering with her relationship with her kids. So she was miserable. So she's telling me all of this and explaining this, And so I said, well, okay, but then I'm just curious because you have this other job offer, and the other job offer was with an insurance company to evaluate cases. I said, why are you asking me anything about quitting? Like, you're clearly miserable. And she said two things. One is, like, I've put so much, 15 years of my life into training for this job. So that's, very typical sunk cost. But then she said something really, really interesting. She said, well, what if I take this new job and it doesn't work out and I'm unhappy there? Mm-hmm. Okay, so here's where we can see this big problem with loss aversion. So I said to her, oh, this is very interesting, right? Because she's clearly miserable in the job that she's in, but she's not seeing it that way, because loss aversion, when we worry about what if it doesn't work out, it's about things we're starting. And the job that we're already in, we don't think about it as starting it fresh every day. It's just sort of the thing we're doing. It's like the status quo. So loss aversion is asymmetric. Like, it gets recruited into these decisions to start new things, but not into the decision about whether to continue doing the thing that we're doing. So now we were seeing this with her. So I just said to her, to try to get her to focus on expected value, I said, well, okay, so if you imagine it's a year from now and you stay in the position that you're in, what do you think the probability is that you're happy? And her answer was 0%.
Right.
Because she knew she'd already been really unhappy for a long time. She tried everything. She talked to her bosses, so on and so forth, right? She'd already done all the things that you would do to try to figure it out. So I said, okay, 0%, that's low. So if you take this new job, what do you think the chances are that you'll be unhappy if I check you out in a year? And she said, well, I don't know. I guess maybe it would be 50-50. And I said, well, is 50% greater than 0? And she said, yes. And she actually quit her job that week. And last time I checked in with her, she was really happy. Yeah. So basically, I was just trying to get her over, this loss aversion. Like, when you quit things, you're usually considering starting something new. Yeah. So if you're thinking so much about just the possible losses, like it not working out from the new thing you're starting, in a way that you're not thinking about it not working out in the thing you're already doing, that combined with this fear of wasting everything you've already put into it makes it really hard for us to switch to new things. But once I put it in terms of expected value, look, I assume your goal is to be happy. What's the probability of that happening on the path you're on versus the new path? It allowed her to see the decision more clearly, and then she was able to quit.
Yeah, it's such a great story. And something I took away from that section, I think it's that section, is that if it feels close between quitting and persevering, it's probably quitting's the better choice.
Well, this is true, like, in every aspect. Like, there's a management heuristic, which is the first time you think about firing somebody is when you should do it. Nobody actually follows that, by the way, but they're getting to that same point too, that if it's actually come to your mind that you're thinking about quitting, because I just want to be clear, all quitting is stopping something that you've started. So if you've hired someone onto your team, if you fire them, it's quitting. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, you're quitting the employment relationship. It's the exact same thing. Exactly. So they're just pointing that out. So there's a variety of reasons why this is. Well, I mean, one thing is, we just saw with, like, Sarah Olsen Martinez, like, there's a lot of forces that are causing us to stick to things too long. Mm-hmm. And so if it's actually come to mind, you're probably, because those forces are creating so much resistance, it's almost always past the time that you should have actually walked away. But there's another really, I think, significant reason why it is that we tend to get to these decisions too late. And it has to do with certainty. So here's a really interesting thing. So when you start anything, whether it's product development, a project that you're managing, a job, a relationship, whatever it is, you're starting it under conditions of uncertainty, meaning there's going to be luck involved, right? Like, so I'm sure people made all sorts of decisions that were then affected by the pandemic. I mean, I didn't have control over that.
Sure.
So that's just how that is. And like, even if I were to make a decision that I knew for a fact was like a great one, like 80% of the time I was going to work out and 20% of the time I was going to lose something very small. That means by definition, 20% of the time I'm going to lose something small, and I have no control over when that is going to occur. I just know it's going to happen 20% of the time. Like once in every 5 tries, it's going to go wrong. And what am I going to do? Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is that there's just hidden information. Like we know very little in comparison to all there is to be known. So when we decide to do things, we're going to discover new information after the fact, because we aren't omniscient. So like, I mean, you can think about how much uncertainty is there when you hire somebody. Right. Like you have a few interviews, like they've never been in the job. They've never done the job. Yeah. So you're just sort of going by like, what do their references say? Maybe you get some backdoor references. Maybe you have them do a practicum. You're trying to get some information, but very little in comparison to like what would be perfect information for you to know whether you should hire that person into that seat. And it's true for the person seeking employment as well, right? All right. So I assume, Andy, that you have had this feeling before. Oh, yeah. I wish I knew that and what I know now.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Right. So that's sort of exposing this uncertainty as we start things. Now, here's the good news for you, that when you discover new information, when you find that new stuff out and that news is not good, you have the option to quit. That's really lucky, because it helps to solve this problem of decision-making under uncertainty, because then you're not just stuck. Like, I wish I knew then what I know now, and I can't do anything about it. Mm-hmm. We usually can do something about it, which is we can stop what we started. But here's where we get into a little bit of a paradox. The decision to quit is also made under uncertainty. Right. So at the time you decide to quit, it's usually like, if you're doing it at an objectively good time, you're going to have to quit not knowing whether you could have turned it around. Right. So let's say that you're working on a particular project. And what we have to remember is that when you're working on that project, that is time and attention and other resources that you cannot put into other projects. Mm-hmm. Okay. So there's a cost to this. Sure. So you're working on this project, and let's agree that you would like to shut it down before you've totally blown the budget and the timeline. And everything tells you that there is literally zero chance that it's ever going to work out. Yeah. Yeah. Because it's before then that other opportunities would clearly be better. Yeah. Okay, but why don't we shut it down before that happens? Because we'll have to shut it down not knowing if we could have turned it around.
We'll always wonder.
We'll always be like, what if? Yeah. What if I had kept going? And that's separate from the fear of what if the new thing I try doesn't work out, and things that have to do with the way that we tend to manage people to outcomes as opposed to decisions. And, obviously, like, honestly, as a manager, I want them to qualify stuff out quickly that isn't working and then really stick to the stuff that is working. But we tend to just want to stick to the stuff no matter whether it's working or not, because we want to know for sure. So we can say, I tried everything. I pivoted. I couldn't get anything to work. And I re-strategized and rebudgeted and re-timelined and put more people on it. And in the end, there was nothing we could do. All right. So what that means when we combine that together, this like the biases that are working against us, and then this kind of what I would call like certainty seeking, like I just want to know so that I can say to someone I didn't have any choice, that we will generally be sticking to things too long, which means that first time that it comes to mind, usually what happens when it comes to mind is we're experiencing the decision as a close call, like very 50-50. Like that first time it comes to mind, we're like, I don't know. But when we experience it as a close call, it's not even close. It's like you're actually already long past the time that it would have objectively been correct to quit.
Yeah. I think that's such an important lesson. And I hope people that's worth rewinding and listening to, because I love how you unpacked that, Annie. That was just so good. That was as good as the book right there. So thank you for doing that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. But here's the thing. This is just my take on it, is I can skew the mental accounting. when I go
Oh
through this,
yeah.
because I think most people who succumb to, let's say, escalation of commitment, they think of themselves as reasonable and rational, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and here, so here's one of my favorite, that must be 20 favorite stories in the book, a mountain climber named Jeffrey. Okay. Because this is a guy who should know better. Right. And yet he succumbed to the escalation of commitment. So would you be up for sharing Jeffrey's
Sure.
story and what we can learn from it?
Yeah. So Jeffrey was a mountain climber, and for people who live in New England, or I guess mountain climbers in general, there's a thing which is completing the 100 highest peaks in New England. It's a thing that you do. So he's climbing his 100th peak. And
not the 99th, but like literally the 100th
literally
one,
the 100th peak.
Yeah.
And we should talk, I mean, particularly when we talk about product management, we should really talk about this problem with goals, because like here's a very clear goal. He's quite close to it. And we can talk about how that actually can really cause disaster.
There was no unless clause there, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So he's climbing, and he happens to be an academic, and he's climbing with a graduate student of his, and a fog rolls in, like a heavy fog, like no visibility type of fog. So his graduate student's like, yo, I don't think that we should continue. And Jeffrey's like, it's fine. I'm going to keep going. And his graduate student says, well, I'm not, and turns around, and Jeffrey keeps going, and they find his body 2 days later. Now, why is this such an important story to know? Because Jeffrey was Jeffrey Rubin, who is one of the first generations of scientists to really study these issues of escalation of commitment. So what is escalation of commitment? This comes from Barry Staw, Jeffrey Rubin, Hal Arks. There's a variety of scientists who were really thinking about these problems back in the 70s. And it's essentially this. We have an intuition that when we see signals in the world that tell us we should stop things, that we will. Like, I think that we all share an intuition that if we were climbing a mountain and a heavy fog rolled in where we had no visibility, we would turn around. Okay. So that's the intuition that we have. And that intuition is just wrong. I mean, it's so wrong that it's like a bonkers intuition, because we don't do that. In fact, when we get that bad news, we tend to escalate our commitment to the losing cause, trying to recover it, right? This is this idea of like, if I stopped before then, maybe I could have recovered the cause. And you can think about it kind of this way. Let's think about it for Jeffrey R., right? Jeffrey Rubin is, if you walk away, that's when you say, I have failed to reach the peak and I will never do it. Like, right. I mean, at least in that moment, right? Mm-hmm. But if you hold on, maybe you can turn it around. So like if we're managing a project, when we shut it down, that's when we admit defeat. That's when we go from things are going poorly and it's kind of failing to I have failed. Right. And that is awful for us. So we'd rather hang on. And as you said, like rationalize away the signals to come up with some reason that we should continue, all in the service of hoping to recover the cause so that we don't have to walk away kind of in the losses, right? We don't have to walk away knowing that we have failed when maybe there's something that we could have turned around. Now, why Jeffrey Rubin's story is so important is that, as I said, he was one of the people who really started to develop the science around this problem. So if anybody knew about escalation of commitment, if anybody understood the problems, particularly as you're that close to a goal, right? If anybody understood the problems of how we get entrapped in these losing causes and we ignore the signals that tell us that we ought to stop, it was him. And yet he died on that mountain that day.
Yeah. I feel like the more I read about cognitive biases, the more I succumb to thinking I can avoid them. Right. And that's, I think, a really good example of we're maybe never more at risk. And yet, so here's something I seem to recall, and once again, I think it's in that same sort of section that has helped me so much. I've had this conversation with so many people since reading the book, is there's a saying in poker that poker is one long game. Okay. Right. And well, maybe he was looking at this as one long 100 mountains, but he has more mountains to climb. Right.
And he has that mountain to climb again.
Right. Exactly.
See, that's the thing. It's like, if he had quit, he could have come back another time and he could have completed it. But you get so caught up in the moment. It's called being in it.
Yeah, right.
Where you end up with this way of thinking short term. So, I love what Ron Conway says, which is life's too short.
Mm-hmm.
And he's trying to get that poker is one long game thing across in terms of life. Like, your life is really short. Like, spending any time on something that isn't worthwhile is such a tragedy when you should be playing for the long run. How do I make sure that over the course of my life, I'm doing things that I'm winning to, that are making me happy and fulfilled and getting me to achieve the things that I want to achieve, not getting so caught up in like, did I win this particular hand? Did I climb this particular mountain at this particular moment?
Yeah.
And we have to start to like get ourselves out of it into this longer term view, because it's only when we sort of get up to that more 10,000 foot view that we can see whether something's worthwhile or not. And that's the whole game, right? Is this worth my continuing or not? If it's worth my continuing, even if there are obstacles in my way, even if it's hard, even if I'm having a bad day, I should continue, right? Like, we all need that grit. But if I get up to that 10,000 foot view and I see there's a really heavy fog rolling in, and the probability that I die is really high, I should just give up this short-term goal of making it to the top of the mountain today, and I should quit so that I can come back when it is worth my time.
Yeah. I just think of this stuff I got wigged out earlier in my career, like, oh, this meeting or this argument or this one project, this one presentation. If we think of it as, hey, this is one long game, right? It would just reduce the stakes, it feels like.
Right.
And, yeah. Anyway, I that one has really impacted me there. And I feel like the world of project management is just filled with opportunities to suffer from the illusion of progress. So you talked about this illusion of progress, which I thought was so interesting. We can bump into monkeys and decide to work on pedestals, so to speak. So I don't know. I'd hate for you to, I want people to read the book. Okay. So you don't have to give it all away, but how about this? If you wouldn't mind just introducing the idea, and then can you think of a way that metaphor of monkeys and pedestals has helped you personally, whether at work or home?
Sure. Yeah. So if there's a few ideas in the book that I think are like so important for product managers, but monkeys and pedestals would probably be the most important if I had to choose among them. And there's a lot of things in there to really make you better at this. So what Jeffrey Rubin tells you is knowing about it doesn't help. Okay. So then the question is, what does, right? And it all has to do with advanced planning, thinking in advance about, first of all, what are the conditions under which you might stop? But also, how can I approach a project in order to make sure that I get to the information that I need as quickly as possible about whether it's right to continue, right? Because remember, a lot of what causes us not to walk away is the time and effort and money and attention that we've put into a project that we don't want to waste. So if we can reduce the time and energy that we put into something before we get to the answer of whether it's worthwhile to continue, obviously the better off we're going to be.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay, because we're just sort of reducing the debris that we're carrying into the decision. And this brings us to monkeys and pedestals. And this mental model comes from Astra Teller, who's the CEO at X, which is Google's in-house innovation hub. He's otherwise known as Captain of Moonshots. So obviously they're doing things that are incredibly innovative. So when we go back to that problem of when we start things, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you don't know. When you're doing innovative things, obviously that increases, right? Like what you don't know gets bigger. And so he's really thought, because like even an outfit like Google has limited resources, I suppose more limited than they used to at the moment.
All right. Yeah.
As do most companies at the moment.
Yeah.
So he's trying to think about, how do I kind of sort through as we're thinking about these projects that get pitched to us, right? How do I sort through as quickly as possible, like what's worth pursuing and what's not?
Yeah.
Okay. And I want to do that as fast as possible, because again, I want to quit the stuff that isn't working quickly. And then I want to concentrate all of our capital onto the things that are working. So here's how he thinks about it. Imagine that you have decided that you want to train a monkey to juggle flaming torches while standing on a pedestal in the town square. That would make a lot of money, right?
Right.
You'd pay to go see that. Okay, so there's two pieces to that project. One is training the monkey to juggle the flaming torches, and the other is building the pedestal. And what his point is, don't build the pedestal first. That you need to go monkey first. You've got to see if you can train the monkey to juggle the flaming torches. Now, there's a variety of reasons for that. Let's think about what they might be. The first is we always want to avoid anything that creates the illusion of progress. So, I mean, here's my question for you, Andy. What's the thing you don't know if you can do? But build the pedestal, train the monkey to juggle flaming torches.
Oh yeah, we could, the pedestal, we could figure that one out, right?
Yeah, like we know.
Yeah.
So if you build the pedestal first, it creates the illusion of progress. You haven't actually made any progress because you already know that you can do it. Okay. So he's trying to avoid that illusion of progress. Okay. The second thing, and this should be obvious, is that there's no point in building the pedestal if you can't train the monkey to juggle the flaming torches. Like the act is that's the whole thing, right? That's going to unlock the whole system. So there's literally no point. The third thing that he points out is that as we're building this thing where there's no point if you haven't trained the monkey, and it creates the illusion of progress because we already know we can do it, you're accumulating sunk cost. Right? People's careers are getting tethered to the project. Their identities might be getting tethered to it. They're starting to create ownership over these things because now they own the pedestal that they've built. And all of these things are now going to make it harder when you discover that you can't train that monkey to juggle those flaming torches. It's going to make it harder for you to actually quit. Right? Which brings us to his fourth kind of really big insight, which is when you butt up against a monkey that's hard to train, you'll tend to turn to building pedestals rather than quitting.
Absolutely.
Okay. So what he does is when he's approaching any pitch, he says everything is monkeys first. So he wants to identify what are the monkeys and then tackle those first to get to no or yes as quickly as possible. He just wants a yes or no as fast as possible. And he tries to avoid any pedestal building before he can train the monkey. Obviously, sometimes you have to build some pedestals to get the answer, but like he's trying to minimize that. So like, I'll give you an example. Like there's projects that he's done. Like, as he says, there's sometimes where he spent sort of $2 million to find out that information, whether you could tackle the monkey. But he knows that if he hadn't done monkeys and pedestals, that he would have spent $9 million. And he doesn't consider that a waste of $2 million when he quits. He considers it a savings of $7 million. So here's one of my favorite examples. This one is not in the book. There's a great example in the book about the California bullet train. Go read that one because it's amazing. I love that. I mean, it's such a good examples of monkeys and pedestals. But I'm going to give you one that is mentioned briefly in the book, but I'm going to expand on it because there was an article that came out after I wrote the book that was so great. So over at X, they were pitched the Hyperloop. Are you familiar with the Hyperloop, Andy?
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
Okay. Yep. So it's like you're going to vacuum a tube of train
like at the bank when they go, they send the
right, exactly. But it's a train full of people going from like New York to LA.
Not checks.
Yeah, exactly. In like 2.5 hours. That's the whole idea. So it's like high speed transport and like this particular, like I love you, the bank, right? Where they go, right, exactly. Like inter-office mail.
Right.
Before you had Slack. Okay. So they got pitched this. And after the pitch, they did a monkeys and pedestals exercise on it. So they want to understand what are the monkeys and what are the pedestals. In this particular case, the technology itself, like building the system, was a pedestal because they already knew that they could transport things through a vacuum. Right. As you pointed out, they've been doing it in banks for a very long time, and they actually knew that they could do it with larger items. So, that actually wasn't a monkey. So often the technology itself will be a monkey, but in this case, it wasn't. So they identified two monkeys. The first monkey was a regulatory issue. So if you're going to go all the way from New York to LA, that's going through a lot of townships. And every township has different regulations, things about right of way, eminent domain, so on and so forth. So they were like, ooh, that seems like a really big problem to solve. Like, how do you actually satisfy every single one of these townships to get this thing to actually go across country? And, Astor Teller sort of said, we're Peter Pans with PhDs. We're not really in the regulatory business. So that seems like that seems like a hard monkey, but maybe one we could solve if it was worth it. But that's definitely a monkey. We'd have to figure out if we could solve the regulatory issue. So what they would do in that case is before they built anything, they would go and hire an expert and sort of do some sort of feasibility on whether you could solve that. But that was the first monkey. The second monkey, though, was much more important, which was, if the thing is going this fast through a vacuum tube, can you actually stop the thing without killing everybody on board?
Oops.
So but that's the unknown, right? Because they've never built something that actually transports humans this way. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that was the big question that they had. So they felt this was the bigger monkey. Mm-hmm. And they had a little chit chat about it. And what they realized was that in order to actually answer that question, you would have to build a system, enough of a system that could get the train to full speed. Mm-hmm. And then you would have to test whether it could stop safely. So remember that the system itself is a pedestal. So what he realized is that when they sort of did the math of how much of this would you actually have to build, it was most of it. Mm-hmm. So he said, oh my gosh, like you're going to have to build basically the whole system, this humongous pedestal, expensive, humongous pedestal, before we can actually find out if you can solve for this monkey. So they went, this is not for us.
Yeah.
Now, can you take a guess how long it took them to say no?
Oh, I mean, it's such a good idea that you'd want to put, you can see how people could put years and millions into this. Yeah. Yeah. Did they shut it down quickly?
15 minutes.
Yeah. Isn't that amazing? Like that's consistent with the other stories you talked about in that, with that group.
That's right. 15 minutes. So now flash forward. I see an article in the New York Times about the Hyperloop. Yeah. So Virgin decided to pursue the Hyperloop.
Interesting.
They've spent tens of millions of dollars. I think I think they've raised $160 million, and they've spent a lot of it. Like they may have spent even 100. I don't know. Go look at the article. Mm-hmm. The details are fuzzy, mm-hmm. but it's tens of millions of dollars. It could be actually 9 figures. All right. So the New York Times is like, they've run into some snags. So can you guess what the 2 snags are that they've run into?
Stopping it or getting people on and off or stuff like regulatory or whatever. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. So exactly. So here's the problem. They've only built enough of the system to get this train up to 1/6 of its ultimate top speed. And they're sort of saying that's a safety test, but like they know it's not a safety test. Mm-hmm. So they actually haven't been able to test the safety of it because they haven't built enough of it to make it go fast enough. And meanwhile, they've spent like $60 million to only get it to go 1/6 of the speed. And then they're running into all these regulatory issues. Yeah. Okay. So look at one team spent 15 minutes. Right. The other team has spent years and tens of millions of dollars to find out the exact same darn thing, because one did monkeys and pedestals and one did not. And that is like such a huge power of this mental model. Now, here's the great thing. Remember, I said to you that an insight that Astro Teller had is that once you start to build pedestals, when you butt up against a monkey that's sort of untrainable, you'll turn back to building pedestals. So the kicker in this article in the New York Times was what Virgin's new plan was, which was to make the thing carry cargo. And it's like, wait, no, but your original idea was to get people really fast where they didn't have to go on a plane. They could actually get to LA faster than a plane. Yeah. And I don't think we have a cargo transportation problem.
Right. Yeah.
I think that's a pedestal. Like nobody needs the cargo thing solved. It's the person transporting people across the country thing that you're trying to solve. So notice that instead of giving up, they're just raising more money and they're like changing it to, oh no, now we're just going to build cargo. I mean, we're going to take cargo across the country. And it's just like, it's like Astro Teller's like some sort of time traveler, right, because he saw all of that coming. Yeah. But he didn't fall for it because they did monkeys and pedestals. Yeah. So, I think in the end, like the big lesson there, well, okay. have you ever been in a meeting where people say, what's the low hanging fruit?
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Is that like every meeting?
Those are the pedestals, right?
Right. And what does everybody say? That we want to know what the low hanging fruit, because let's get that done. Let's get that out of the way so that we can start moving forward. And it's like, no, don't do that.
Yeah.
Not unless it's in service of solving a monkey. Now, if it's in service of solving a monkey, which you might do if you're building like minimum viable product, right? You've got to write some code, which is a pedestal. You have to write some code or, create a prototype or something like that, just in order to see if you have product market fit, right? But no, other than that, like, don't just build pedestals because it's low hanging fruit and you can get it done. That's nuts. Don't do that.
That's so good, because Annie, the other thing comes up in that same meeting is we need a quick win, right? That could easily be illusion of progress, right?
Right. Exactly. That's exactly right.
Oh man, I got to tell you, I mean, I wish we had a chance to have a cup of coffee and a longer conversation. I want to be respectful of your time. Let me just end with this. We have a lot of parents who listen to the podcast. And can you think of any way you've tried to help your, I think now relatively grown children think
relatively grown.
Yeah, but any ways you've tried to help them think differently about quitting?
Well, yeah, I mean, I tell them that quitting is fine.
Yeah.
I mean, again, but it's not, look, I want to be clear. I tell them quitting is fine when the thing they're doing isn't worthwhile. So, here's what I've tried to do the opposite of. Someone told me a story that I thought was so great, which is their parents wanted him to play a musical instrument. And so they let him choose, and he chose the saxophone. And he's playing the saxophone, and the taste of the reed in his mouth was like, just for some reason, just really, really unpleasant for him. It was like horrible. Yeah. So he asked to quit, and they said no. Why? Because everybody thinks that like grit is character, right? So he hated it. They wouldn't let him quit. And now he like doesn't play any musical instrument, and he hates listening to the saxophone because it gives him like PTSD. Why didn't they just say like, okay, but then what are you going to switch to? Like, it's fine. You chose the saxophone. You found out new information. The reed makes you want to puke. So, okay, that's fine. So what's the unreeded instrument that you're now going to play? Which would have been like a really good way to approach it, right? So I really tried with my kids to get them to think about like, what's the broad goal that you're trying to achieve, and not get so hung up on the particular thing that they were sampling. So I would always treat it as, yes, you should try it. And in fact, so much so that, like I remember when my son decided he wanted to play goalie in soccer. And he hadn't really done it before. And he was sending me like the most expensive goalie gloves and, this kind of stuff. And I was like, let's start small. Right. Let's see how it goes. Let's think about this as an experiment and see whether you like this. And I'll get you perfectly good gloves, but not like these very fancy gloves, because I don't think we need to invest in that yet. Because it was sort of like you're experimenting and you're young and you're not supposed to necessarily know what you're going to like. So he played for a season. He wasn't good. He's very good at other things, but not necessarily good at that. And we sort of, planned for that in advance. So I would always just try to think about, like, I want my kids to do enrichment activities. I want them to try after school stuff, but I really taught them to be samplers.
That's good. Yeah.
Much more than just the idea that just because you started something, don't quit, or you're just a complete loser.
Yeah, I couldn't help but think of David Epstein's book Range when you were, because he's a friend of yours.
It's on the shelf behind me, right there.
Yeah, it's likewise, and I think both of these are books that align very nicely with. I think sometimes I feel as a dad of 5 that there was this temptation to be like, as a software developer, go be a software developer. I know how to help you with that. And one of them says, I want to be a colorist in the film industry. I'm like, I don't know how to help you that. But thankfully, we didn't say shut it down. We said sample. And it's led to these other things. And I think as parents, if they want to change their major, like you talk about that, if they want to change their school,
go ahead.
There might be good reasons to not, like, I feel more convinced than ever, Annie, your book reinforces nothing gets wasted. I mean, maybe that's an
No.
exaggeration, but for the most part, nothing gets wasted,
No,
right?
actually, so what I'll say is no, there is something that gets wasted, which is future time and money and
Right.
attention in the
Yeah.
service of thinking that you're just supposed to stick to things,
That's
or
it.
you're a loser, or you'll have wasted your time in the past.
Yeah.
Whatever you've put into something, by definition, it's like not a waste. Like, I'm sure you've learned things from it.
Mhm.
It's gone.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah, it's gone.
where things get wasted is when you don't make a decision to walk away from something that isn't worthwhile
Yeah. Yeah.
because of all these forces that make you stick.
Yeah.
And then you're now, how many times have you seen someone in a relationship where, like, for the last 2 years, they've been telling you how bad it is, and they really need to break up with the person, and they don't do it. And you ask them why, and they're like, "Oh, I've put so much time into it."
Been together for
And
so
then,
long.
right. And then it's like, and then what are you going to do? You're going to now be 5 more years in a relationship that's making you miserable. That is actually a waste.
That's good. Yeah, that's a good place to end. For those listening, so much of what we do as leaders of people and project, it's related to decision making. And if this discussion is resonating with you, I strongly recommend you check out Annie Duke's newest book, Quit: The Power of Knowing When to Walk Away. I put links to the book and the book's website in the show notes for this cast. So Annie, thank you so much for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.